Welcome back to the School Muscle, another solo Q&A. First question comes from Gary, and he basically asks, why do you cycle from your MEV to your MRV, and why don't you just stay around your MAV? And I think that's a great question, Gary, because, there tends to be two different kind of approaches to training volume across the mesocycle. And one approach is more so you start out at a lower volume, around your minimum effective volume that gets you pretty good results, your MEV, and you work up to a volume level that you can, about the most you can do that you can recover from, your MRV. And then there's another approach of kind of just hanging out in between those 2 points and getting stronger over time and kind of doing that sort of thing rather than instead of really using volume as a tool for overload. And I kind of just answered it right there. So I prefer kind of working up in volume across the mesocycle. And my main rationalization for this is because my specific goal is hypertrophy. Like, honestly, that is really all I care about. And I also care about like health and how it impacts my confidence and the other things that lifting weights can have trickle effects into your life. I care about those things like as much as anything. Now, of course, I still enjoy getting stronger and that sort of thing, and I definitely like getting stronger, but my main focus is hypertrophy. And I think that the main variable resulting in muscle growth seems to be volume over other things. Volume, with the caveat that each set, when I'm talking about volume, I'm talking about sets per muscle per week, with the caveat that each set is still a difficult set, still taken within a few reps from failure. So since volume seems to be one of the leading indicators of growth, then I think it makes a lot of sense to use volume as a tool for overload, to make sure you're applying overload via the tool that matters most for muscle growth. It's kind of how I rationalize it anyways. Now, volume is a measurement of like how much mechanical tension you're placing on the muscle. And there's 3 different mechanisms of hypertrophy: mechanical tension, metabolic stress, and muscle damage. And what seems to be pretty well accepted is that mechanical tension, how much tension you're placing on your muscle, seems to be most important. And I think that some people mistake mechanical tension for just load on the bar alone. But rather, I think that mechanical tension is more so your total volume in terms of how many sets you're doing, how many reps you're doing, how much load you're using. Yes, load is a component. I definitely think that. And how much time is spent under that load. I think all those things play into mechanical tension. I think volume, how many sets you're doing, is just one of those indicators, and that indicator seems to be more resultant in muscle growth. Y'all get what I mean? Y'all, what am I, from the South? No. But that's kind of how I rationalize with myself. And the approach of just kind of staying at a volume to where it's between those 2 points, between your MEV and MRV, and gradually getting stronger and using your strength as a tool for overload, for that mechanical tension overload. I think that's a great approach too. I think that it works really well for a lot of people, and people see really good results with that. And kind of hanging out at a similar volume might be more beneficial for actually gaining strength, and practically gaining strength over the long term might be one of the most important things you can do for gaining muscle. Like, I think at some point you're going to have to get stronger. So I think that makes a lot of sense as well. And I also think that at some point, your window between like your MEV and MRV is going to get pretty tight. And it might turn into, hey, I need to do at least 10 sets for my hamstrings to grow. But if I do 14 sets, I'm pretty wrecked. So it might end up turning into, well, let's kind of do between 10 and 12, 13 sets and focus on getting stronger. And I think that would work really well. But I also think that there's, some pretty advanced people that kind of work from their MEV to their MRV. Shout out to Steve Hall, who still accumulate volume across the mesocycle and see really good results with that approach as well. Now, would these people see really good results kind of hanging around their MAV and focusing on getting stronger over time, but still doing plenty of volume and things like that? Yes, I definitely think that's the case as well, because these people are probably also doing a lot of other things that help them maximize the amount of growth they're seeing. But to me, man, it just makes a lot of sense to apply progressive overload via the tool, via the variable. It seems to be the biggest indicator of muscle hypertrophy. And I think that if you start out at a lower volume and progressively work to higher and higher volumes, then you're going to be able to accumulate more total training volume, more recoverable total training volume, because the goal isn't just volume. You want to make sure that volume is recoverable and that it actually leads to progress. But I think progressively working up in volume is going to result in more total work done than if you kind of hung out at a similar range. And you kind of jump with your increasing MRV, because we get this repeated bout effect to where you do one bout of training and then you get better at recovering from that specific bout of training. So you can recover from more and more and more to a point across the mesocycle. And just that approach makes a lot of sense to me. So it's almost like you're jumping with your MAV each and every week, because your MAV is probably like a moving target, because your MRV, the amount of volume you can recover from, is going to change across the mesocycle. Like, I know a lot of people will have probably found that they come back to training after, a week off or something like that, and they do one set of lunges and they're wrecked. But in the middle of the training cycle, when you've done lunges the last 3 weeks, it might take 3 or 4 sets to get a similar amount of soreness or damage or whatever it might be. So I think that your MAV moves around quite a bit, and that if you just try to hang out at your MAV, then it could potentially be your MEV after a few weeks, and that you accumulated a little bit more volume, you might see a little bit better results. But there's probably individuals to where just hanging around their MAV is all they're going to adhere to, or all they really need to do at this point of their training to see really good results, and potentially all that they care about. Like Scott Stevenson talked about on a podcast that some people's MEV is their only thing. Like that's all they're going to want to do in the gym, is just kind of that minimum effective dose to where they still see results, but don't have to get insane with it. I think there's nothing wrong with that approach. Like, you're someone that kind of does the 20% in this lifting thing that gets you 80% of your results. Like, that's great. There's a lot of cool things in life besides trying to maximize how much muscle you can grow. But I also really respect the people that really try to chase this down and try to really, really improve themselves. And anybody that gets involved in lifting weights, I have a high amount of respect for, and we're all kind of part of team lifting weights. But then again, there's also some really, really intelligent, thoughtful, great people that don't like exercising at all. And I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with those people either. And I would be more than happy to respect them if they're a nice, respectable person. So I think what I'm trying to say here is that, to me, it just makes sense to progressively work up in volume, because it is seemingly the leading indicator of growth, and just makes a lot of sense to me. And that doesn't mean that you don't use other tools of progressive overload. Like, I'm still a proponent of trying to get stronger over time. Still a proponent of working closer and closer to failure across the mesocycle to help manage fatigue and to produce overload that way. So I think that it's important to use all of these variables to your advantage rather than just focusing on just getting stronger or just adding volume or just training harder and harder and harder. So that's kind of my rationale for that, Gary. The next question comes from Aster, and he says, if HIIT is a similar adaptation to strength, does that mean it's a lot better for hypertrophy than MIS? Moderate intensity cardio versus high intensity cardio is basically the premise of this. And I would say that HIIT, high intensity cardio, taxes a similar energy system in comparison to lifting weights, kind of your anaerobic energy systems to produce ATP and all that good stuff that we learned in exercise phys. But I wouldn't say that it's going to result in a similar adaptation on your muscle compared to like strength training and hypertrophy. Because I would not say the stimulus of doing HIIT intervals is the same stimulus as doing sets of 10 on the squat for your legs. I would rather place my muscles through a full range of motion and place them under a mechanical tension overload with that external resistance of the bar. And I think that's going to be a much different stimulus compared to doing like HIIT intervals. So I wouldn't think of like cardio, HIIT as a tool to grow muscle. That's not really how I would think about it. Like, can people grow muscle doing that sort of thing? Yes, I do think that there's a little bit of literature that people just like walking on the treadmill, if they're super untrained, they can grow muscle. And like an extreme example is people that are put in like casted or put in bed rest, just walking around after they're in that situation will help them build muscle. People that are astronauts in space, when they come back to gravity, just being under that tension of gravity will help them build muscle. So yes, if you're novice enough or you don't have any adaptations at all, then yes, you can grow muscle doing something like HIIT, but I wouldn't say that it's better for hypertrophy because I don't think it's good for like hypertrophy at all for most people. And if two people were completely untrained and they wanted to grow muscle and the only things they could do was either HIIT or MIS, then yeah, HIIT might be the better option, but I don't think that it's going to lead to like significant hypertrophy adaptations compared to like regular bodybuilding or strength training or something like that. But it does like tax a similar energy system. So you could see similar like energy system adaptations in your physiology and things like that, but I wouldn't really use it as a tool for muscle growth. So I hope that helps you out there, Aster. And my boy, Cali Aesthetics, says, with squats, is it better training in the 8 to 10 rep range, 12 to 15, or both? I largely think that your rep range doesn't matter a ton if you're in like that 8 to 15 rep range on average and you're tracking your volume in terms of sets per week and each set is within a few reps from failure. I don't think your rep range matters a ton. But in the context of squats, I would kind of prefer staying in that 6 to 10 rep range most of the time. Just because I think that with squats, there's a chance that you run into systemic fatigue before muscle fatigue, before you like hit that 1 to 2 reps in reserve. So, for example, doing sets of 15 on squats, you might run into like metabolic fatigue. You might get a little bit more gassed. You might start feeling nauseous. You might build up a lot of lactate and have more systemic fatigue before your peripheral fatigue is limiting you on a muscle basis, which if your systemic fatigue is limiting you and resulting in you reaching failure versus your muscles, then you might run into a situation where you're not recruiting your entire spectrum of motor units and muscle fibers, and it might be better for you to stay in that lower moderate rep range. So with these kind of big compound lifts like this, like deadlift, squats, lunges, I for the most part would probably stay away from that 10 to 15 rep range for the most part. Like, can people build a huge set of wheels doing squats of 10 to 15 and lunges in that range too? Yeah, I definitely think that you can, and I'm not saying you can't, but I think for most people, staying in that 6 to 10 range for the most part on average probably isn't a bad idea. So you don't have to worry about running into those, that systemic fatigue before that muscular fatigue. That's kind of how I would approach that. Now, could there be benefits of going up above 10 reps every once in a while and going below 5 or 6 reps every once in a while? Yes, I definitely think that there can be benefits to doing so, but I would keep my bread and butter the majority of the time. I would use those compound lifts, deadlifts, squats, lunges, things of that nature in that 6 to 10 range for the most part there, calisthenics. The next question comes from Messinod, and they ask, regular deload versus 4 to 5 days off. So by regular deload, I believe they mean like cutting your volume in half and just more or less doing some less stressful training, but still going in the gym each day of the week that you normally would, but making it a little bit less stressful to kind of bring down fatigue, versus maybe just doing the first half of that week and then taking the next half off. So you have like 4 to 5 days completely off. And I believe Valentine Tambosi talked about this, is that he likes taking like a full 4 to 5 days off. And I think AJ Morris talks about it as well, that he enjoys doing that. And I see benefits to doing both. And I think depending on the individual is going to depend on what you decide to do. So some people like staying in their routine and they have no problem going to the gym and just having it be a lighter session. And the potential benefit of doing that is that you might get some active recovery. You might get some blood flow to the area. You might provide a little bit of a signal for nutrient partitioning and that sort of thing. And that could be beneficial for recovery. Now, my argument against that would be that the main things that seem to be important for recovery are training within your maximum recoverable volume. Like if you're doing too much training, you're doing too much training, and there's no amount of modalities that are going to help you with that. The next thing is probably like eating enough food, sleeping enough, relaxing enough, managing stress, and then active recovery might be kind of towards the bottom of that list. And if we're strictly talking about hypertrophy, it might be more beneficial for people to just stay out of the gym and just take that time and relax. Because I think relaxing and managing stress might be above kind of active recovery, especially for bodybuilding purposes. So taking that full 4 to 5 days off might provide a little bit more stress relief and might be more beneficial than the potential benefits of active recovery. So I think that makes a lot of sense to do. And if we're talking about like strength, maybe you want to get in there and do like at least like one heavier set to maintain strength. But if you're only taking like the second half of your deload week completely off and you're getting out of the gym, and I'm not sure if that's really going to result in much of a strength loss at all. So I don't know. I think I kind of lean towards just taking the second half of that deload week completely off, maybe going in those first 2 days and then taking a full 4 to 5 days off, because I think that the potential benefits for just complete mental refreshment of not going to the gym, like it's kind of just another thing you have to do that you have to think about in your head. You have to pack clothes. You have to get ready with your pre and post workout and things like that. Maybe you don't do that on a deload, but kind of get what I mean. It's just another potential stressor that you have to do. And I think that taking this full 4 to 5 days off can be beneficial for just reducing that. And I'd probably lean towards doing that. But some people, maybe if they don't stay in their routine, it could be difficult for them to adhere to their training program and to kind of get back into things. In that case, maybe you don't want to take a full 4 to 5 days off because maybe it's hard to get back to it. But like you're talking about like AJ Morris and Valentine Tabosi, these dudes probably have trouble like not training too much. And if they could, they would probably spend, if they could benefit from it, they would probably spend as much time as they needed to in the gym, and they're not going to have a problem with adherence coming back to it. So in a situation like that, I think, yeah, it makes sense to take a full 4 to 5 days off. And I've done them both. I personally prefer just taking the days completely off because it just opens up more time in my schedule, and I've got things going on in my life just like everybody else and other commitments, and it helps having that little bit of extra time, and I enjoy that. So I do think that there's benefits to both, but I would also like try to not go to the point so much to where on a deload to where you do like nothing at all, to where you kind of lose that repeated bout effect so much to where you come back to training and you can hardly do anything without being kind of under recovered. Or I would just be really careful about when you come back from those full days off that you start out at a lower volume and you gradually increase it. Now, if you only take like 3 to 4 days off at the end of your week, are you going to run into that as much? Probably not compared to taking a full week off, but that's just something that I'll be cognizant of as well. So hope that answers your question for the most part there. And next question comes from Fly French. Ooh, another Valentine Tabosi question. This dude's my guy. Like his following is so loyal. Like after our podcast had so much positive support from that was crazy. But anyways, they asked, Valentine Tabosi says delts respond well to high rep up to 30. Thoughts on that? Well, I ain't gonna argue with Valentine, that's for sure. That dude knows the stuff. Pretty jacked dude. Go check out the podcast. Hit him off. He knows what he's talking about. And I don't see a problem with that. The only thing that I might see a problem with going up with really high reps like that is that you can start to run into some of that systemic fatigue potentially before your muscle fatigue. So depending on the person, they might end a set because they are either tired, they have accumulation of lactate, they're getting too much of a burn, and that's preventing them rather than their actual muscle fatigue. So that results them in ending a set because before they have recruited all their motor units, like I kind of mentioned previously. So that's my only concern with using like quite higher reps. But with the nature of a lateral raise, it's a pretty low systemically fatiguing exercise. So in that scenario, you might not run into that systemic fatigue as fast as like a barbell squat or a lunge or something like that. So you could probably, quote unquote, get away with these higher reps without running into that systemic fatigue limiting a set as much. So in that context, then, yeah, I think that you could probably incorporate these higher rep sets with great success. And I mean, a potential benefit of this that I can kind of think off of the top of my head is that if you're using these lighter weights, you can almost really get into a rhythm in a single set of feeling your muscle, actually engaging your lateral delts, because a lot of people struggle with that. And kind of doing these higher rep sets are a potential way to really lock in your form as you go set, really control the weight as much as you can, and to really get a good stimulus from that. And doing these higher rep sets might be a really good way to accumulate quite a bit of volume or mechanical tension on the muscle and that time under load, because you're just doing so many dang reps. Now, there's also the problem of a set of 30 just takes so much more time to do than a set of like 10. So from a pure efficiency standpoint, maybe it's not necessarily the best thing you could do. Maybe, but then again, efficiency doesn't always equal like muscle growth. And then something else to consider is that I feel like when you're in a calorie deficit, sticking in a more moderate rep range, in my experience anyways, seems to work a little bit better, which is almost kind of counterintuitive because some people think that when you go through a deficit, you should use higher reps. But I've found that when I'm in a deficit, kind of staying in that 6 to 10 range, 6 to 12 range, maybe on lateral raises more so the 8 to 12, tends to work pretty well for me because I feel like I just don't have that stored glycogen, that stored carbohydrate to work in these higher and higher rep ranges. And it feels like I can lift the weight, but there's just like no energy there. It just feels weird. And I feel like I run into that less when I stay in that kind of 8 to 12 range. So I would be concerned about doing these like really, really high rep sets in a deficit. But then again, one could argue that doing these high rep sets, you're not going to have to use as much load. So there's going to be a less systemic fatigue with that. So during a deficit, that might be beneficial. That might cancel out not being able to lift as much because of just not having a lot of stored carbohydrates. So, man, there's a lot of things to consider here. And that's probably why there's not one strict answer for any of this stuff, and why, depending on someone's preferences and the individual, that a lot of freaking different approaches can work. And in general, I think that doing these high rep sets of up to 30 can be beneficial. And I would do really high rep sets. I would do lower rep sets. I would do sets of 6 to 10 with lateral delts where you sway. I'm not afraid to do that either. And just kind of varying that rep range and that stimulus, I think, is a good idea. And this next question is right along these lines as well. And it's from BB_God. And he asks, the role of systemic fatigue in hypertrophy training and fatigue management techniques. So systemic fatigue is kind of the idea that you have this total amount of stress that the body can take, this total amount of fatigue, and that's limited. And various things can play a role in this, whether it's life stress, girlfriend dumped your ass, whatever it might be. Different things can play a role into this systemic fatigue. And how does that play into like hypertrophy? Well, if you can recover from more training stress, more recoverable training stress, then you might see better results. And if you have less kind of stress going on in your life, less of these potentially catabolic processes from other chronic stresses in your life, I think that you could see drastically better results by reducing these stresses and having more training to recover from and having more generally anabolic processes going on in your body. I definitely think that this can play a big role. So as for managing this systemic stress, I think that it's just important to try to keep things in daily life. Like I'm not going to go too far with this because I don't want to sound like I'm a 22-year-old philosopher or anything that knows all this life stuff. But I would just really try to keep things in perspective. Like a lot of the day-to-day things in life don't really matter because the reality is you only have X amount of time on this earth. And when you're looking back in 30 years, you're probably not going to think about a lot of this day-to-day stresses that are stressing you out. Keeping that in perspective and keeping in perspective, like someday, your time is limited and you're going to have to, punch your card and call her good on life at someday. And I'm getting pretty morbid with this, but I feel like this is something to consider when things are like stressing you out. It's like, man, is this really going to matter down the line that much? And I don't want you to go into a state of like nihilism to where nothing matters at all. That's not a great place. Because things do obviously matter. But I think it's important to keep perspective on what matters. For example, like if I'm stressing myself out about having somebody on the podcast or something with school or work or anything like that, I just try to keep perspective like, man, someday you're going to die. So this little shit right here doesn't matter at all. That's kind of the biggest thing that I use to manage stress. Like I meditate each morning, but my meditation is like 10 deep breaths is what I call meditation. Like I hardly say that qualifies as meditation, but that's the minimum amount that I've been able to adhere to. I'm slowly trying to work that up. But I do think that having some sort of relaxation routine built into your day is important for managing these stresses. I think having relationships and social connections with people is important for managing stress. Like, I'll get a not the nicest comment on YouTube that will get to me a little bit, and I'd be lying if I said that these comments, I totally just brush them off and ignore them, because at the end of the day, I care how the people that follow me are impacted by what I say. I do care about that, and I try to hold my content to a standard, and when it doesn't meet that standard for some people, I don't love that. I'm not saying it gets me down or it depresses me, because it definitely doesn't do that. Like, if it's just brutally negative, like, I don't bother, because hurt people. But just having somebody to talk to about some of that stuff, man, I am going down a path here. But just having those social connections is good for managing stress as well, I think. And that's kind of the biggest things I do to manage that systemic stress, like getting enough sleep. That's going to be important. Eating enough food so you're not in a calorie deficit. That's going to be important for not putting your body under more stress than it needs to be. But at some point, like, a little bit of stress is good. And you should still like try to push yourself. Like, the amount of work I do now would have stressed me out a ton a year ago. But slowly increasing my work MRV, so to speak, over time, gradually increasing that tends to help. And that's how I'd kind of manage that systemic stress a little bit. And on a like more muscle building level, like in your training, I think that you have to consider systemic stress. Like, I still think that there's only a certain amount of stress that you can kind of handle in a single session. But if you have some intra-workout nutrition, that can increase a little bit. But like, at some point, training session over like, I don't know, 2.5, 3 hours, like, at some point you're going to be a little bit capped on how much you can do. But I do think that over time, if you gradually increase, that you could probably have some productive longer sessions. I do think that. But I've seen benefits from splitting it up into shorter sessions per week to kind of reduce that single session systemic stress. I think that can be beneficial. And I've talked about it before on a per set basis, kind of doing really, really high rep stuff can, especially on more taxing lifts, can potentially result in you hitting the systemic stress. And this is something that Chris Beardsley discusses or has discussed, is that if you are doing these high rep sets, you can hit this systemic stress kind of limiter. That becomes your limiter to your single set compared to your actual peripheral muscle stress. And that can limit your motor unit recruitment and recruiting your entire muscle fiber, and that can result in less hypertrophy growth as well. So I think that's something to consider as well. And I think the practical recommendation off that is maybe don't get tied into just working into 15, 20 plus rep ranges all the time. Vary your rep range. Maybe work in that 8 to 12, 8 to 15 rep range on average, maybe 6 to 10 rep range on average for those more taxing barbell squats, deadlifts, lunges, things like that, and that might be beneficial. And you can also use things like days off, deloads, working progressively closer and closer to failure throughout a mesocycle. All those things are ways to manage stress. I think a reps in reserve of 2, leaving 2 reps in the tank on average across the mesocycle is a pretty good return on, you're getting a pretty good stimulus, but not crazy fatigue. So that's kind of how I would manage systemic stress of life and in training as well, by using those deloads. I kind of like a deload after every 4 or 5 weeks, somewhere in there seems to be a pretty good sweet spot for me anyways. And that's kind of how I manage it there. So I hope that helps you out there. I know you're a longtime follower and I appreciate you. I think you were around when I had like 20 subscribers and we were getting like 3 views on each video, and you were there encouraging me, and I can't tell you how much that means to me. So I do really appreciate that. And my final question for this Q&A is stretching my knowledge base a little bit. Don't worry, I got you. And this was a YouTube comment, and I didn't write down the name. Apologies, but I think you'll know after I ask. And it was basically, what's the role of like antioxidants and hypertrophy? So some people say that you should like avoid having a lot of antioxidants because that can blunt hypertrophy. Some people will say that you should have antioxidants because that can help with recovery. And what are we even talking about? Like with antioxidants, what's the physiology behind this? Well, when you exercise, your body is going to produce energy, and it is going to have certain oxygen reactions in the body to metabolize and produce this energy. And this is going to be a really simplified, dumbed down version because I am not super like well studied into the really molecular physiology behind oxidative stress and molecular biology and all that good stuff. But the dumbed down version is that when you exercise and you produce ATP, you have certain reactions in the body to produce this ATP, and these reactions can potentially cause some like all this oxidative stress. And too much oxidative stress can potentially result in some more like negative health complications. Too much chronic elevations in oxidative stress. So that's where the role of these antioxidants come in, is they reduce this oxidative stress, and that can be potentially beneficial. That's kind of the idea behind it. So let's first cover whether antioxidants can help with like recovery, soreness, and things like that. And a Cochrane review in 2017 basically looked at antioxidants and their role in recovery. And basically what they found was that there's no significant effects of antioxidants on recovery. So for a recovery aid, based on this review, doesn't seem like there's a lot of merit to them. And you might want to save your money a little bit there rather than supplementing with these antioxidants. But the next question is, will having like antioxidants, foods with higher antioxidants, and a quick Google search will pop that up for you, will this result in a blunted hypertrophic response? And there was another review by Mary and Risto in 2016 where they looked at antioxidants, the hypertrophic response, insulin sensitivity, all that good stuff. So I really recommend going through and reading that if this isn't of interest to you. But they basically found that it may hamper mitochondrial biogenesis. Bunch of side stock that who the hell knows what that means? Let me know, but I don't. Anyways, insulin sensitivity. So how well you might partition calories towards like your muscles and stuff like that after training. And hypertrophy. What may hamper that. But I think this is in the context of like supplementing with antioxidants and having quite large doses of antioxidants. And it also goes on to say that if reactive oxygen species is already like chronically elevated, it's already high, like in the elderly, then having some more antioxidants might be beneficial for hypertrophy. So it's almost like there's this kind of sweet spot to where if your like oxidative stress is already high, in which it might be like the elderly, then having some antioxidants might be beneficial for growth and stuff like that. But if your oxidative stress is already pretty low, then more antioxidants might kind of blunt this oxidative stress, because this oxidative stress, this reactive oxidative stress, might be a potential signal for anabolism and different pathways that result in hypertrophy and insulin sensitivity. This stress can signal these adaptations to occur. So that's why we want a little bit of this stress. A little bit of stress is good. It results in adaptation. So if we took so many antioxidants to where we weren't getting any of this stress at all, then it might blunt things. So I think that the practical recommendation from this is that as long as you don't go out of your way, if you're generally healthy, you're pretty young, and you don't go out of your way to supplement with large doses of antioxidants, then I don't think it's something that you really need to worry about. Like, this is kind of similar to the NSAIDs thing, to where NSAIDs in the elderly, and this is like stuff like Tylenol and ibuprofen, steroidal, anti-inflammatories in a population that already has like chronically high inflammation, an NSAID might actually be a little bit beneficial for them. But then again, we want a little bit of inflammation to signal some of these biological processes that result in growth. So in a more normal context, healthy person, you might not want to go out of your way to have large doses of these things, because it could potentially blunt the stress or the inflammatory response that could blunt adaptation. So I think as long as you're not going out of your way to have high doses of these, that you should probably just fine, in my opinion anyways. So that is all I got for this Q&A. Thank you so much for tuning in. It means the world to me when you guys screenshot this, put it on your story. I really do appreciate it. Make sure to drop your questions below on YouTube, or shoot me a DM if you have questions or anything like that. And I will see you in that next one.